They said she had everything: the home, the husband, the perfect smile. But behind that smile was a silence the world refused to hear. In 1950s America, millions of women lived picture-perfect lives that were anything but perfect. They laughed for the camera, cried in secret, and carried the weight of an impossible dream. This is not the story the magazine showed. It's the one they hid. Stay with me till the end, because once you see what was behind her smile, you'll never look at those perfect 1950s photos the same way again. Back in 1950s America, every magazine cover seemed to promise the same dream: a spotless kitchen, a smiling wife in pearls, and a husband who walked through the door at 5:30 sharp. The ads called it happiness. The neighbors called it success. But behind that perfect picture was a story few ever dared to tell. She woke up before sunrise, tied her hair neatly, and pressed her husband's shirt with quiet precision. Breakfast was always ready before the paper hit the porch. She wore her best dress even when no one was watching, because somewhere out there she imagined people were. That was life for the American housewife. It wasn't written in any rule book, but it might as well have been carved into every cereal commercial and detergent ad of the decade. The 1950s told women that their greatest purpose was to serve. After World War II, nearly 6 million women left jobs they had taken during the war and returned home. Society didn't ask them if they wanted to. It simply expected it. Advertisers called it the feminine mystique, a phrase that promised elegance, grace, and devotion. But it also built invisible walls around millions of women who felt they could never admit to wanting more. Television became their mirror. Programs like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best painted family life as effortless and pure. The wife was always cheerful, her makeup perfect, her voice soft but never tired. She had no problems, no pain, no dreams outside the home, only a smile that never faded. Millions of women compared their real lives to those images and wondered what was wrong with them. They didn't know that the actresses were directed to smile between takes, even when their cheeks ached. In reality, many 1950s housewives battled exhaustion and quiet depression. Doctors called it housewife syndrome, a term buried in old medical journals describing the emptiness women felt after years of repetitive domestic work. But no one dared talk about it at the dinner table. The suburban code of silence was strong. If you had a home, a husband, and healthy kids, you had no right to feel unhappy. Behind closed doors, some women wrote their thoughts in hidden diaries. Others found small escapes: a late-night radio show, a walk around the block, a conversation with a neighbor who understood without words. They carried the weight of perfection on their shoulders because the world told them that was their role in the grand picture of American life. But that picture was built for the camera, not for the soul. The smile she wore was never just hers. It belonged to advertisers, to expectations, to a culture that worshipped appearances more than truth. And yet through it all, she endured with quiet strength. She made a home out of duty, but love kept her from walking away. Her laughter still echoed in the kitchens of that era, even when her heart whispered for something more. When we look back at those glossy black and white photos now, we see the beauty, but we also sense the ache behind it. Those smiles tell two stories, one the world wanted to see and one it wasn't ready to hear. So the next time you see a 1950s housewife smiling from an old magazine ad, remember, that smile wasn't always joy. Sometimes it was courage, sometimes it was silence, and sometimes it was the only way she knew to survive in a world that never asked how she truly felt. Because in the end, the perfect picture wasn't a reflection of her life. It was a mask she was told to wear. Every afternoon in 1950s suburbia followed a quiet rhythm. The children came home from school, the husband soon after work, and the wife, still in her dress and apron, greeted them with that same gentle smile. To the outside world, it looked perfect, but that silence between the clinking dishes and the hum of the refrigerator held more truth than any smile ever could. In those tidy suburban homes, loneliness became the secret guest no one talked about. Many housewives spent entire days without adult conversation, their only voices coming from soap operas or the neighbor's radio drifting through an open window. They moved from room to room, cleaning spaces that were already clean, trying to fill the emptiness that came after everyone left for the day. The world saw devotion. They felt isolation. Doctors of the time began to notice something strange. Perfectly healthy women were coming in with fatigue, sleeplessness, and sadness they couldn't explain. One doctor wrote that his patients had everything a woman should want, yet none of them were happy. The media ignored it. Magazines told women to buy a new lipstick, redecorate the living room, or bake a new recipe to find joy again. But joy couldn't be bought in a box of cake mix. It was in those silent hours after the laundry was folded and the last dish put away that reality whispered. Some women looked in the mirror and didn't recognize themselves anymore. Their dreams had quietly faded into the wallpaper of the lives they built. They were mothers, wives, homemakers, but somewhere deep down, they wondered who they were when no one was watching. Letters from the era reveal small cracks in the perfect picture. A woman in Ohio wrote to ladies. Every afternoon in 1950s suburbia followed a quiet rhythm. The children came home from school, the husband soon after work, and the wife, still in her dress and apron, greeted them with that same gentle smile. To the outside world, it looked perfect. But that silence between the clinking dishes and the hum of the refrigerator held more truth than any smile ever could. In those tidy suburban homes, loneliness became the secret guest no one talked about. Many housewives spent entire days without adult conversation, their only voices coming from soap operas or the neighbor's radio drifting through an open window. They moved from room to room, cleaning spaces that were already clean, trying to fill the emptiness that came after everyone left for the day. The world saw devotion. They felt isolation. Doctors of the time began to notice something strange. Perfectly healthy women were coming in with fatigue, sleeplessness, and sadness they couldn't explain. One doctor wrote that his patients had everything a woman should want, yet none of them were happy. The media ignored it. Magazines told women to buy a new lipstick, redecorate the living room, or bake a new recipe to find joy again. But joy couldn't be bought in a box of cake mix. It was in those silent hours, after the laundry was folded and the last dish put away, that reality whispered. Some women looked in the mirror and didn't recognize themselves anymore. Their dreams had quietly faded into the wallpaper of the lives they built. They were mothers, wives, homemakers, but somewhere deep down, they wondered who they were when no one was watching. Letters from the era reveal small cracks in the perfect picture. A woman in Ohio wrote to Ladies' Home Journal, "I love my husband and children dearly, but some days I feel invisible. It's as if I exist only to make things easier for everyone else." The magazine never published her letter. The editors wanted stories about cheerful homes, not confessions about emotional hunger. Even so, women began to notice each other's silence. A cup of coffee shared between neighbors became a kind of therapy. One might say, "Some days I just feel tired," and the other would nod, both knowing exactly what that meant. They couldn't speak freely, but in those brief exchanges they found understanding, a language born from unspoken pain. Meanwhile, television continued to sell the illusion. A smiling mother handing her child a sandwich, a husband laughing from his recliner, the perfect family that never argued, never cried, never questioned. It was the same smile repeated across every screen, polished, controlled, unreal. Millions of women copied it without realizing they were part of a silent performance America demanded from them. That silence became generational. Many daughters watched their mothers suffer in quiet strength and grew up believing that being a good woman meant never complaining. But inside, those mothers carried oceans of untold stories, of dreams deferred, ambitions buried, emotions locked away because the world refused to see them as anything beyond the role they played. And yet, even through that silence, they built something beautiful. They raised families, kept traditions alive, and held together the fragile illusion of the American dream. But the truth was, it came at a price, one that could never be measured in dollars or domestic perfection. So the next time you see a smiling 1950s housewife in a vintage ad or family photo, remember, behind that soft expression was a quiet storm. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. It was her way of keeping peace in a world that never asked what peace cost her. Because sometimes silence isn't emptiness, it's the echo of everything she wanted to say, but couldn't. By the late 1950s, the cracks in the perfect suburban picture had grown too deep to hide. The glossy smiles on magazine covers still promised happiness, but behind the closed doors of countless homes, something had shifted. The silence that once felt safe now began to feel suffocating. For the first time, many women were starting to wonder, was this really all there was? Day after day, the same rhythm played on repeat. Breakfasts served with mechanical grace, the same chores performed in the same order, the same quiet evenings waiting for the sound of the husband's car in the driveway. Some women began to feel time folding in on itself, each day blending into the next until weeks disappeared like pages torn from a calendar. The house gleamed, the children smiled, but inside a storm was building. There was no language yet for what they felt. The words anxiety or identity were rarely spoken in a housewife's world. Doctors prescribed pills, small pastel-colored promises meant to lift the mood. They called them mother's little helpers, and they became as common in kitchen drawers as recipe cards. For a moment, the fog seemed to lift, but beneath it all, the ache remained. Some women began to write. Hidden notebooks filled with private thoughts, quiet confessions scrawled between grocery lists and reminders. I love my family, but sometimes I feel like I've vanished. She wasn't alone. Across the country, more and more women felt the same invisible erosion of self, though few dared to admit it aloud. It wasn't rebellion yet, just a whisper, a subtle shift in the air, in the way a woman paused before folding another shirt or stared longer than usual out the kitchen window. A restlessness she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. That restlessness was dangerous in a world that prized obedience, yet it was also the first sign of awakening. Television still showed perfect families, and the magazine still preached perfection, but the illusion had begun to lose its shine. The laughter sounded hollow, the smiles too rehearsed, and when one woman dared to say she was unhappy, others quietly nodded, relieved that someone had spoken the truth they'd been hiding for years. Some women found small ways to reclaim pieces of themselves: a painting class at the community center, a night school course in literature, a secret journal tucked beneath the mattress. Tiny acts of defiance that no one else would notice, but that made them feel alive again. The world didn't change overnight, but in those moments they began to see themselves not just as wives or mothers, but as women with dreams worth naming. And that terrified the world around them. Husbands, neighbors, even magazines warned against losing femininity or forgetting the home. But once a question is asked, once a mind begins to awaken, it cannot easily be put back to sleep. Beneath the tidy lawns and painted fences, an invisible revolution was quietly beginning to stir. Because sometimes breaking doesn't mean failure. Sometimes it means finally seeing the cracks that were always there and finding the courage to stop pretending they aren't there. The perfect picture had started to blur, and behind it, real women were finally starting to come into focus. By the dawn of the 1960s, the world that once felt still and certain began to tremble. Beneath the polished surface of suburban life, quiet ripples of change moved through the kitchens and living rooms of America. The housewives who had once kept their doubts folded away with the laundry were beginning to find their voices, softly at first, but growing stronger with every passing day. It started in whispers, a conversation at a church meeting, a line in a book, a late-night discussion between neighbors who had once only shared recipes. Words like purpose, freedom, and identity began to slip into spaces where they had never been spoken before. It wasn't rebellion yet, not in the loud marching sense, but it was awakening. The realization that the perfect home didn't have to be the boundary of a woman's life. Some women returned to school, sitting beside younger students who called them ma'am. Others wrote letters to editors, questioning the glossy images that had defined their generation. Why, one woman asked, do we teach our daughters to dream, only to tell them to stop when they marry? Those questions, once dismissed as discontent, were now becoming the seeds of a movement. At the same time, the world outside was changing too. The civil rights struggle, the youth culture, and the early voices of feminism began to reach into those quiet homes. For the first time, women saw reflections of their own restlessness in the news, in songs, in stories that dared to question the old order. The illusion that had once bound them began to unravel thread by thread. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique landed like a thunderclap. It gave a name to the feeling millions of women had carried in silence, the problem that has no name. For so long, they thought the emptiness was personal, something wrong with them. Now they saw it was universal. Their loneliness had never been a flaw. It was a symptom of a society that had caged them in roles too small for their spirit. Change did not come easily. Many husbands resisted. Families argued over dinner tables once filled with quiet routine. Magazines published articles warning of the dangerous new woman. But the tide was turning. Housewives who once smiled through exhaustion were now reading, writing, questioning, and teaching their daughters to do the same. Some joined women's groups where they could speak freely for the first time. Others found courage in simple acts, applying for jobs, demanding education, asking for respect. They weren't just keeping homes anymore. They were building identities. The same hands that once scrubbed floors were now holding pens, typing letters, organizing meetings. The same voices that once only called children to dinner were now demanding equality. And yet, even in this awakening, there was tenderness. These women didn't want to destroy the home. They wanted to redefine it, to make it a place where love and individuality could coexist. They weren't rejecting family. They were reclaiming themselves within it. The smile of the 1950s housewife hadn't vanished. It had changed. It no longer was the mask of survival. It was the expression of choice.